Good morning. I'm delighted to be back here today in St. John. We're here to talk about securing Canada's future. I understand that for years you've been let down by the Liberals. But really, if we're being honest, you've been let down by everyone in Ottawa. Depuis des années, les libéraux vous laissent tomber. Mais pour être honnête, tous les partis vous ont laissé tomber. I just want to say that up front. I know that our party has ground to make up here, so I want to make sure I'm here to listen to you. I want to know your thoughts, hopes, fears, and dreams. And I hope that at the end of this campaign, which is coming up, you'll look at Canada's Conservatives a little differently. I've come here to talk to you directly about our plans to lift up, rebuild, and rejuvenate our country. And I hope today I can persuade you that this plan, Canada's Recovery Plan, will help the villages, towns, and cities you live in. Je suis ici pour parler de notre plan pour améliorer, rebâtir et revitaliser notre pays. Et j'espère qu'aujourd'hui, je vais réussir à vous convaincre que ce plan va aider les communautés, les villages et les villes d'où vous venez. I know that far too much focus in our country is often spent on our big cities. But out here, in the Maritimes, we're in the heart of Canada. You know, my years living in Atlantic Canada were some of the best years of my life. Every day, I would wake up and know that I was serving in the forces alongside other Canadians to help our country. Search and rescue missions, patrolling our fishery, standing up for our country, something Atlantic Canadians know well. Being part of the people, the culture, and finding a home for me away from home was absolutely great. And it was great to know that I was making a difference alongside other Canadians. Serving my country was one of the best things about being in the Maritimes, but not the best. I was lucky enough to meet the most wonderful woman in my life who's here with me today, my wife, Rebecca. Je garde des bons souvenirs de mon service dans les Maritimes, mais ce n'est pas le meilleur. J'ai eu la chance de rencontrer ici la femme de ma vie, mon épouse Rebecca. In a different walk of life, we could have been able to stay, and I often wonder and wish that we had. But I know that, despite the region's greatness, families here face the same worries. Skyrocketing housing prices, a cost of living crisis, and underfunded health care from the federal partner. It's about time we had a Prime Minister who personally knows and understands the challenges facing families, facing our communities. Someone who knows what it means to live, to learn, and to serve in Atlantic Canada. Someone who loves and will fight for Atlantic Canada. And so what I'm asking today is to be your voice in Ottawa. For 6 years, Justin Trudeau has broken promises on the economy, on jobs, on the environment, on safe drinking water, on ethics. 4 weeks ago, Justin Trudeau broke yet another promise to Canadians, to not call an election during the pandemic. He asked the country to give him a majority. It's an unnecessary election that is costing us $600 million. Money that our healthcare system desperately needs. Pendant 6 ans, Justin Trudeau a brisé ses promesses sur l'économie, sur les emplois, sur l'environnement, sur l'eau potable, sur les réserves et sur l'éthique. Il y a 4 semaines, Justin Trudeau a encore brisé une autre promesse, de ne pas déclencher une élection en pleine pandémie. Il a demandé au pays de lui donner une majorité. C'est une élection inutile qui nous coûte 600 millions de dollars, de l'argent dont notre système de soins de santé a besoin. But rather than presenting any sort of vision for the country over these last few weeks, Mr. Trudeau has engaged in a campaign of scaremongering and misinformation. Such negative American-style and divisive politics should have no place in Canada. Canadians deserve better. You deserve better. Right from the start of this campaign, we've shown you what a vote for the Conservatives will get you. The sole focus of Canada's recovery plan is getting our economy back on track. Dès le début de cette campagne, j'ai montré ce qu'un vote pour les conservateurs va vous donner. L'objectif principal du plan de rétablissement du Canada est de remettre notre économie sur les rails. It's our plan to secure jobs by recovering the 1 million jobs we lost during the pandemic and more. Accountability by introducing tough, new, and necessary anti-corruption laws. It's about securing mental health by implementing our Canada Mental Health Action Plan. It's to secure the country by building up our capacity to respond to future pandemics and threats. And it's about securing the economy by balancing the federal budget over the next decade. But it's also a plan to focus on exactly the issues that have challenged this region in the past. Unemployment, a lack of support for seasonal work, underfunded healthcare. That's our plan, a plan for Canada's recovery. But this election is about more than plans and policy. It's about trust. The question is, should Justin Trudeau be rewarded for calling a $600 million election in the middle of a pandemic? Canada's Conservatives have heard you. Canada's Conservatives get it. And now we are asking to represent you. Cette élection est plus qu'une question de politique et de plans. C'est une question de confiance. La question est, est-ce qu'on va récompenser Justin Trudeau pour avoir déclenché une élection de 600 millions de dollars au milieu d'une pandémie? Les conservateurs vous entendent. Les conservateurs vous comprennent. Et maintenant, les conservateurs veulent vous représenter à Ottawa. Et on va vous représenter. Canada's Conservatives will secure the future of every community across Atlantic Canada and across Canada. Atlantic Canada was once my home, and I want to work with you to continue making it a great place to live, work, and raise your family. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
We will be taking questions. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions. First question.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. Rachel Aiello, CTV News. You have said that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has handled COVID far better than Justin Trudeau. With what we're seeing in that province now, do you still think that's the case?
As Prime Minister, I will work with all premiers, regardless of strike, to fight against the pandemic. A pandemic that we need to fight. And Mr. Trudeau didn't fight. He called an election, a $600 million election. He stopped the briefings from Dr. Tam and tried to actually use health to divide Canadians. I will work with everyone to fight COVID-19 and to secure our economic recovery, and Canadians are tired of Mr. Trudeau constantly putting himself first. Mr. Trudeau a déclenché une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars en pleine pandémie. Je vais travailler en étroite collaboration avec tous les premiers ministres dans notre lutte collective contre la COVID-19. Les Canadiens, les Québécois méritent mieux. Et M. Trudeau, il va toujours placer ses intérêts avant les intérêts des Canadiens.
With respect, you didn't answer the question. Who do you think has handled the COVID pandemic better? Do you still think that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has done a better job on the pandemic, on the rebuilding, than Justin Trudeau?
The question Canadians are asking is who's going to put their needs first. In this pandemic election caused by Mr. Trudeau, $600 million. What could that $600 million do? It could build hospitals. It could help our front lines who are tired. So as I said, I will work with all premiers, regardless of political stripe, something that hasn't happened for 6 years with a Prime Minister constantly fighting premiers. We need to fight together against COVID-19. And the fact that we're in an election, a $600 million election because of Mr. Trudeau's own political interest, shows that he's not going to put the health and economic needs of the country first. Canada's Conservatives will.
Next question.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. Hannah Thibodeau, CBC National News. I want to follow up on that question. Unfortunately, you didn't answer it again. And I think Canadians are sitting at home wondering about the pandemic itself, not specifically about this election. Who do you think did a better job handling the pandemic? Provincial Premier Jason Kenney or Prime Minister Justin Trudeau?
Canadians are sitting at home, as you said, wondering why we're in an election in the fourth wave of a pandemic. Mr. Trudeau called an election that's costing us $600 million rather than keeping the Delta variant from spreading, rather than actually working together. So the federal Prime Minister needs to partner with the provinces, needs to deliver on vaccines, on rapid tests, needs to keep variants out of Canada. Mr. Trudeau has failed to do all that. It's made the job more difficult for all premiers. I will be there not to fight with them, but to provide leadership. And I would never call an election in the middle of a health crisis. I'm not sure why Mr. Trudeau did. Mr. Trudeau a déclenché une élection en pleine de la 4e vague de la pandémie. C'était inacceptable. Les Canadiens, les Québécois méritent mieux. Et comme j'ai dit, je vais travailler avec tous les premiers ministres, n'importe quel parti, pour le bien-être de leurs citoyens. Au Québec, une donation à l'autre. Mais comme d'habitude, M. Trudeau va placer ses intérêts avant les intérêts des Canadiens. Et les Canadiens, les Québécois méritent mieux.
I want to follow up. Mr. Kenney last night has changed his stance on vaccinations. He says that getting vaccinated is a personal choice, but it has public consequences if you choose not to. Can I get your thoughts on that? And also, have you had a chance to speak with Mr. Kenney before he made his announcement and since then?
I have not. But what I have done in the last year is consistently advocated for access to vaccines for Canadians. Vaccines are safe and effective. I say this every day because it's important. And I never would have partnered with China to deliver a vaccine for Canada. Mr. Trudeau did. Mr. Trudeau was late on rapid tests, late on keeping the Delta variant out of Canada, and now he's called a $600 million election rather than do his job, rather than work together in our collective fight against COVID-19. As I did when I lived in Atlantic Canada and wore a uniform, I will always put the country first, and Canadians are tired of a Prime Minister mired in scandal, always putting the interests of the Liberal Party ahead of the health and economic well-being of this country. Les vaccins sont un outil très important dans notre lutte contre la COVID-19. Les vaccins sont sécuritaires et efficaces. Et il y a un an, j'ai demandé un approvisionnement suffisant des vaccins. Mr. Trudeau a eu un partenariat avec une entreprise chinoise pour nos vaccins. C'est un autre exemple d'un Premier ministre totalement déconnecté avec les besoins des Canadiens. Et maintenant, nous sommes en pleine d'une pandémie à cause de lui. Les Canadiens, les Québécois méritent mieux.
Next question.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. Stephanie Taylor from the Canadian Press. You are running to be Prime Minister, and as Prime Ministers have to respond to current crises and situations, and it seems that you're sidestepping questions about the crisis in Alberta. So what do you make of Alberta's COVID situation? They've had to reimpose lockdowns, introduce vaccine passports, limit gathering sizes for even folks who are vaccinated. So what do you make of Alberta's announcement last night and the current situation the province finds itself in the pandemic?
I've consistently said that we will work with the provinces and respect the decisions they make with respect to fighting the Delta variant wave of COVID-19. Each province are putting the best decisions forward for the health and economic stability of their provinces. From one coast to another, they need a federal partner that will help them. They need a Prime Minister that will keep the Delta variant out of Canada. It was the Conservatives that fought Mr. Trudeau to stop flights from countries where variants of concern were out of control. He was late at the border at the beginning of this crisis. He was late again, and the Delta variant got a bigger hold in Canada than it needed to be. And to think about it, rather than double up our resources to fight this Delta spread, he called an election. The $600 million this election costs could be helping all provinces in their fight. So as Prime Minister, I will be there as the wingman to the provinces to fight COVID-19 and to secure our future.
Follow-up question, please.
You say the provinces did the best job they can. Well, Mr. Kenney and his government has admitted they got it wrong yesterday. So do you think Alberta could have done anything different or earlier to avoid the crisis they find themselves in?
Throughout this crisis, all the provinces have tried to make the balance between keeping public health paramount and balancing off the economic needs. All provinces have shifted and adjusted based on the various waves of the pandemic. But what the provinces have not had is a consistent and reliable partner in Ottawa. Mr. Trudeau fights with people. I will fight for Canadians. And we would never have let the Delta variant get its hold in Canada. So what Canadians have to realize is this election is about a choice. The Prime Minister who ignored the Delta variant and called an election a $600 million election, or someone who will make sure we're ready, that has a plan to make sure we are never again caught slow and unprepared for a pandemic. That's why the fourth pillar of Canada's recovery plan is to make sure we lead and partner. We're not falling behind and dividing the country as Mr. Trudeau does.
Prochaine question.
On a un plan pour le rétablissement du Canada et le quatrième pilier est sur les futures pandémies. On doit être plus près dans le futur avec les tests de dépistage rapide des vaccins fabriqués chez nous. Et les provinces méritent un partenaire à Ottawa. Et je vais être prêt pour les défis comme une future pandémie. Et M. Trudeau, il a déclenché une élection en pleine pandémie. Une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars, c'est inacceptable.
Prochaine question.
Oui, Laurence Martin de Radio-Canada. Monsieur O'Toole, si vous devenez premier ministre, puis je ne sais pas si tout à coup il y a, disons, 15 000, 20 000 cas en Alberta, est-ce que vous allez répéter la même chose? Je vais travailler avec les provinces, je vais laisser Jason Kenney faire ce qu'il veut en Alberta?
Je vais travailler avec les provinces, au Québec, en Alberta, dans notre lutte collective contre la COVID-19. C'est pourquoi c'était totalement irresponsable de déclencher une élection en pleine d'une pandémie, d'arrêter les brevetages par Dr. Tam et les autres. Une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars. Avec 600 millions de dollars, on va construire des hôpitaux, aider les premières lignes. Les Canadiens et les Québécois méritent mieux qu'un premier ministre qui va toujours placer ses intérêts avant les intérêts des Canadiens. On a besoin d'un changement d'une nation à l'autre. We deserve a change from one coast to the other. And Mr. Trudeau has called an election in the middle of a pandemic. He stopped the briefings on public health, has divided people, and this will cost us $600 million. Think of what could be done with $600 million in the middle of a health crisis. You could build hospitals. You could give relief to front lines. But Mr. Trudeau will put his own interests first. Canadians deserve better than a Prime Minister always in ethical scandal, always breaking his promise, and now he's asking you for a reward. Well, it's in Canadians' hands.
Monsieur Kenney a dit hier, le choix de se faire vacciner ou non, ce n'est pas qu'un choix personnel. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec ça, Monsieur O'Toole?
Les vaccins sont importants. J'encourage tous les Canadiens, tous les Québécois à se faire vacciner. Il y a un an, j'ai demandé les vaccins, j'ai proposé des vaccins parce que les vaccins sont sécuritaires et efficaces et on a besoin d'un approvisionnement suffisant des vaccins et peut-être dans les prochaines semaines des boosters aussi. M. Trudeau était lent avec les tests de dépistage rapides, lent avec les vaccins, lent avec la frontière. Et maintenant, nous sommes en pleine d'une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars. Les Québécois, les Canadiens méritent mieux et j'espère qu'on va recevoir leur appui pour notre plan et un Premier ministre plus sérieux.
Prochaine.
We're in the midst of a $600 million election that's all about Justin Trudeau. Canadians are going to be able to make a decision. Mr. Trudeau called this election, but you have a choice. He does not deserve to be rewarded for calling a $600 million election. We need a Prime Minister that will not be late with securing rapid tests, not be late with securing vaccines, not be late at the border, including in later waves where the Delta variant was let in. So I'm asking Canadians to vote for a team that will be fighting for you, that will be ready in the future, and will rebuild this country.
Prochaine question.
Oui, bonjour M. O'Toole, Henri Ouellet du journal La Presse. Je voudrais vous faire réagir sur les propos qu'a tenus ce matin Justin Trudeau, affirmer que la détérioration de la situation en Alberta devrait faire réfléchir les Canadiens qui s'apprêtent à voter en laissant entendre justement que l'élection de Erin O'Toole pourra emmener le pays dans la même direction. Qu'est-ce que vous lui répondez?
M. Trudeau était là à la frontière avec la variant Delta. Et maintenant, on a une quatrième vague à cause de sa lenteur. Et qu'est-ce qu'il a fait? Il a déclenché une élection en pleine d'une pandémie. C'est totalement irresponsable par un Premier ministre toujours en scandale, toujours là pour les Tinamis et pas pour les Canadiens. Et c'est pourquoi il y a un choix le 20 septembre, un choix pour notre avenir, un choix pour un plan pour le rétablissement du Canada, un plan pour la nation québécoise, ou M. Trudeau et sa élection. Le choix est clair.
On a beaucoup parlé de vote stratégique dans les derniers jours. Vous en pensez quoi? Et dans les comtés ou par exemple dans les secteurs où par exemple Maxime Bernier pourrait faire des gains, est-ce que c'est un argument que les électeurs conservateurs devraient avoir en tête, de voter stratégique?
Il y a seulement un chef qui peut remplacer Justin Trudeau. Ce n'est pas M. Blanchette, c'est moi. On a une équipe extraordinaire ici, au Nouveau-Brunswick, au Québec et à travers le pays. Et on a un plan pour le rétablissement du Canada et notre contrat avec les Québécoises et les Québécois. J'invite les Québécois d'examiner mon bilan, notre plan et de voter pour le futur. On va agir pour les priorités québécois. Et après 6 ans de M. Trudeau et des ingérences dans la Chambre des compétences, les Québécois méritent une chaise à la table de décision et une voix forte à Ottawa.
Next question.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. Kate Bolingaro from Bloomberg. Mr. O'Toole, the rise of Maxime Bernier's People's Party has been one of the most surprising things in this election and actually one of the most dangerous when it comes to you having a victory. Are you worried about the vote splits in Ontario costing you seats there, especially in ridings where you're really close with the Liberals?
There is only one leader that can replace Justin Trudeau. And I know people are tired. I know people are sick of Mr. Trudeau's approach of always dividing people, putting himself first, putting this election, this $600 million election, before the health of Canadians. Channel that frustration to replace Mr. Trudeau. We hear you. We know you're frustrated, which is why we have a plan to get our country back on its feet, which is why we have a plan to restore accountability and clean up the corruption around Mr. Trudeau, and a plan to bring this country together. So I ask all Canadians to vote to secure the future, vote Conservative.
And what is your message for these voters that are not going to vote for you under any circumstances and going to the PPC? Are you happy to see them go?
Anyone that wants to build a better country, anybody that wants to secure jobs, anybody that wants to rebuild our healthcare system after 18 very difficult months, there is one choice in this election. It's Canada's Conservatives, our incredible candidates, our plan, and a leader with a track record of getting things done. As I've said, if people are frustrated with Mr. Trudeau, there is one option to replace Mr. Trudeau, Canada's Conservatives, and I ask for their trust.
Next question.
Ian Bailey, Globe and Mail. I think the question remains about whether you continue to support Alberta Premier Kenney's handling of the pandemic. But on another subject, if your party forms government, would you join the new US, UK, and Australia Defence Pact?
Thank you for the question, Ian. This is another example that Mr. Trudeau is not taken seriously by our friends and allies around the world. This is another major gathering of our closest allies that Mr. Trudeau is not even given a phone call. Canada has been a long-standing ally of the United States, the UK, Australia, and others. We're a Five Eyes member, but we're the only country allowing Huawei to bid to be part of our 5G infrastructure. Canadians deserve a Prime Minister who will be serious, that will stand up for our interests and our values. I've proposed a CANZUK initiative that is very similar to what we're seeing happen now with Canada not at the table. We're in a $600 million election rather than fighting for our interests at home and around the world. Nous sommes en pleine d'une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars à cause de M. Trudeau. Et nos alliés sont déçus avec M. Trudeau. L'Australie, le Royaume-Uni, les États-Unis, on doit être là avec nos alliés pour nos valeurs, pour nos intérêts économiques, pour nos travailleurs. Il y a 4 ans, j'ai proposé une entente CANZUK comme le temps de hier. C'est le temps pour un Premier ministre sérieux, éthique et prêt pour les défis chez nous et sur la scène internationale.
With respect, I don't think you've answered the question. If you become Prime Minister in the coming weeks, would you pick up the phone and call the President Biden or the leaders of Australia and say Canada wants in? Yes or no? And if so, why? Why do you think it would be useful for Canada to be in this specific organization at this time?
Yes. Any table where there's a discussion talking about global trade and how we can stand up for our workers, any discussion where we're talking about security, cybersecurity, where we can stand up for our public safety, any discussion where we can talk about values and our commitment to human rights around the world, we need to be part of those discussions. Mr. Trudeau doesn't even show up for votes on human rights when it comes to the genocide in China. He's calling elections. He's not getting called by other countries because Canada is becoming irrelevant under Mr. Trudeau. We're becoming more divided at home, less prosperous, and the world is a serious place with challenges. We need a serious Prime Minister with experience who will restore our position and make sure that we're fighting for our interests, our workers, our security, and our values for human rights around the world.
Next question.
Mr. O'Toole, Michael Couture with Global National. Yesterday, Global News learned that the military justice system cannot hold Canada's most powerful generals accountable. They are really, in effect, above military law, so it's not possible for military courts to try lieutenant generals and above. That includes General Vance and Art MacDonald. So in May, retired Supreme Court Justice Morris Fish wrote a report for the government that warned it would be, quote, legally impossible to try a chief of the defense staff in military courts. So if you were elected, what would you do to fix this? But also, since you were in government, how come you didn't fix it?
We will reform the criminal justice system for the military. We will also end the cover-ups and the culture of sexual misconduct and allegations that have gripped the Canadian Armed Forces. I've said for 8 months, this is critical for me, not just as a veteran myself, but as a father of a teenage daughter who might consider joining our military. We need an independent system, and we need everyone to be held to account. Mr. Trudeau covered up allegations for 3 years, his entire office. Yet another example of a Prime Minister protecting his own job and not fighting for women who were coming forward with complaints about sexual misconduct against powerful generals. That is a complete dereliction of duty of the Prime Minister, but we've seen it time after time. Jody Wilson-Raybould reminding us he was forcing her to lie. People experiencing things differently. It's never his fault. Canadians are tired, and in this election that he's called, this $600 million election, it does give Canadians a chance to stand up for accountability, and Canada's Conservatives will do that.
I just want to follow up on something my colleagues have been asking you about. Yesterday, Mr. Mulroney said that leadership is about making tough decisions, but you seemingly don't want to answer a very simple question about Alberta's COVID-19 response. Jason Kenney admitted today that he got it wrong, yet you had a full-throated support of him just a few days ago. Do you still support Jason Kenney's response to COVID-19, yes or no?
As I've said, I support the provinces in their efforts to try and fight COVID-19. I will have strong relationships with all premiers, regardless of stripe. And the federal government should be partnering and providing support for the premiers, not picking fights with them in an election like Mr. Trudeau has, an election that he called rather than show leadership in a pandemic. Just think about what the $600 million this election is costing could do in our fight against COVID-19. All the political parties voted to not have an election. Mr. Trudeau promised he wouldn't have an election in the pandemic. But we're used to Mr. Trudeau breaking his promises. We're used to him putting himself, close friends, and insiders first. And it's time for a change. And we're hearing the desire for change in all parts of this country. They're tired of Justin Trudeau. There's one solution: Canada's Conservatives and our plan to work with the premiers to fight for Canadians.
Prochaine question. Prochaine question. Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît. Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît. Prochaine question au micro, s'il vous plaît. Prochaine question au micro, s'il vous plaît.
Let's be clear. In a crisis, we work together. I will work with all premiers of all political stripes. Wouldn't it be refreshing to have a Prime Minister that puts Canadians first, that doesn't put his petty interests first, that will work with all premiers, NDP, PC, Saskatchewan? We need to make sure we have a federation that works. It doesn't work under Mr. Trudeau. It doesn't work under Mr. Trudeau. So I will partner with the provinces. I will make sure we close the border and don't let in dangerous variants, and make sure that we have a recovery that includes all Canadians.
Prochaine question, s'il vous plaît. Prochaine question au micro, s'il vous plaît. If there's no more question on the mic, this will conclude the presser. Is there any other question on the mic?
Monsieur O'Toole. Bonjour, Monsieur O'Toole. Stéphanie Marin de la Presse canadienne. Vous avez dit tout à l'heure, we would never have let the Delta variant get hold of Canada. Qu'est-ce que vous auriez fait, vous, pour bloquer le variant Delta?
Arrêtez les vols entre l'Inde et le Canada. Arrêtez les vols entre l'Iran. Arrêtez les vols entre la Chine. Mais M. Trudeau est toujours lent. Au début de la campagne, avec les vols entre la Chine et le Canada, et il y a 5 mois entre l'Inde et le Canada. La frontière est très importante dans une pandémie, et on a vu une approche totalement lente et confuse par M. Trudeau. Et à cause de ça, on a vu une augmentation des cas de variant Delta. Et c'est un défi pour les provinces, pour les municipalités. Et c'est le temps pour le leadership. C'est le temps pour un plan clair. Ce n'est pas le temps pour une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars. Mais malheureusement, comme d'habitude, M. Trudeau va placer ses intérêts avant le bien-être des Canadiens.
À quel moment vous les auriez arrêtés, les vols de Chine et d'Inde?
J'ai proposé ça probablement 2 ou 3 mois avant M. Trudeau. C'était la même chose avec les forces armées canadiennes dans les CHSLD. J'ai proposé 2 mois avant M. Trudeau parce qu'il était lent. Avec le variant Delta, j'ai proposé 1 mois avant M. Trudeau. Les autres voix aussi à proposer d'arrêter les vols. Mais malheureusement, M. Trudeau est toujours lent et toujours ciblé sur lui. C'est pourquoi nous sommes en pleine d'une élection inutile de 600 millions de dollars dans la 4e vague de la pandémie. C'est inacceptable. Les Québécois, les Canadiens méritent mieux.
Prochaine question.
Bonjour, M. O'Toole. Je veux revenir sur le passage de Brian Mulroney dans votre campagne. Vous disiez hier matin à Saguenay que le Parti conservateur n'était plus celui de nos grands-parents, mais vous amenez un premier ministre d'il y a 30 ans et tout le bagage qu'on lui connaît pour soutenir votre campagne. N'y voyez-vous pas une contradiction?
Non, M. Mulroney était une voix forte pour la nation québécoise, pour nos valeurs comme un pays sur le changement climatique, sur l'apartheid, et c'est le temps pour la prochaine génération de leadership. Et j'apprécie ces commentaires sur moi. Et les Canadiens méritent mieux qu'un premier ministre toujours en scandale et sans un plan pour notre avenir. Nous sommes en pleine d'une élection à cause de M. Trudeau. Avec 600 millions de dollars, on va construire des hôpitaux dans notre lutte contre la COVID-19. Donc, j'apprécie des commentaires et je suis ici pour la prochaine génération de leadership avec un plan d'action pour notre pays et un contrat, un engagement clair pour la nation québécoise. Mr. Mulroney was known as a strong defender of Quebec. He was a strong defender of our interests and values of a country, particularly in his fight leading the world on apartheid. It's time for the next generation of leadership that puts our interests first, that puts those values we have as a country first. With Mr. Trudeau, he puts his self-interest first. That's why we're in a $600 million election. Think of what we could do with $600 million in the middle of a health and economic crisis. Canadians are tired of a Prime Minister always in scandal, always putting himself first. And this election, what it does provide is an opportunity for change.
À vous entendre, vous semblez dire que la situation en Alberta pourrait être causée en partie justement parce qu'on est en élection en pleine pandémie. Croyez-vous vraiment que c'est l'un des facteurs, puis que le 600 millions que coûtent les élections aurait pu changer quelque chose dans la situation en Alberta?
M. Trudeau a déclenché une élection en pleine de la 4e vague d'une pandémie. Il a brisé sa promesse. Il a arrêté les brevetages par Dr. Tam. Et c'est impossible pour le Premier ministre d'agir avec les provinces dans une crise en pleine élection. Et c'est pourquoi ce n'est pas le temps pour une élection. Une pandémie, les feux de forêt en Colombie-Britannique, la situation, la crise en Afghanistan. Mais M. Trudeau a déclenché. Pour lui, les Canadiens méritent mieux. Mr. Trudeau called an election in the middle of the 4th wave of a pandemic, while forest fires were raging in British Columbia and while Afghanistan was in crisis. He still put himself first. That's not leadership. And so this election does present an opportunity for change. And I think this country desperately needs change. It needs a plan to get back on its feet. And that's what Canada's Conservatives are offering.
Next question.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. I'm going to assume that you're a bright person, and when you want to answer questions, you do, as you have shown during this press conference. So I'm just going to ask you some very pointed questions, and hopefully you can answer them. Yesterday, Mr. Mulroney said in his speech that you would bring in some tough, he said, there will be tough and deep structural changes to be made for our country. Some of these decisions may make Erin unpopular, but I know that he and his government will persist and implement their agenda. What deep and tough structural changes is Brian Mulroney talking about?
Well, it is time for Canada to get tough on China. We have watched jobs being hollowed out, steel, aluminum, critical materials, and it's time for us to stand up and fight for fairer and freer trade amongst free nations. It's time to not just go after the almighty buck with China as Mr. Trudeau has, the country he most admires, the country he tried to focus on. It's time for a rethink so that we can fight for jobs and opportunity. And beyond those structural changes on global trade that I will fight for, it's also time for a plan for economic recovery, for getting our budget back into balance. Mr. Trudeau never wants to. I do, but in a way that's fair, because we've got to get families back on their feet. We have to get the country working. And that's what I think, $600 million of this election. How many families could that help? Mr. Trudeau's not helping families, he's helping himself.
On another topic, equalization, you've talked about changes that you would like to make to equalization, bring fairness back to Alberta, I believe is the way you phrased it. Would the changes you want to make result in less money for Quebec and maritime provinces such as New Brunswick?
That's a good question, because the premiers agreed a few years ago that fiscal stabilization needed to be fixed because there were provinces experiencing sharp decline in revenues that were overpaying into equalization. So the premiers all agreed on fixing fiscal stabilization. It amounts to an equalization rebate for several provinces. This is an example of the country getting along, working on things together, helping Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, Labrador. Mr. Trudeau didn't act, even though all the provinces were agreed. We need to work together, and that's going to be my approach as Prime Minister, which is why in the fourth wave of a pandemic, I'd be saying, what supports can I get the provinces? What could I do with $600 million to help people? I wouldn't be calling an election, but it shows Mr. Trudeau's priorities are always about Mr. Trudeau, not about people here in St. John, not about people in Atlantic Canada, not about Canadians. It's time we had a Prime Minister and a team that will fight for Canadians.
Next question.
Hi, Mr. O'Toole. I have a question on the Conservative position on assault weapons. Specifically, the guns banned by the Liberals include the M14 used in the 2014 Moncton shooting death of 3 RCMP officers and the injury of 2 others. The Conservative Party policy now is to keep the current ban in place, but then review Canada's gun classification system. Yes or no? Is there any chance that the M14 becomes legal again?
As you said, the Conservative position is to maintain the restrictions in place on firearms, including the Ordering Council, and to have a nonpartisan, fully public review of the way classifications are done. And the tragic shooting in Moncton is something that still resonates today. In fact, in May, as part of Mental Health Week, I had a widow of one of the officers speak on mental health and trauma. So public safety and security is important. We need to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and give the resources to police officers to do that. We need to fix our border and the smuggling problem that is leading to more and more shootings in our big cities. So I want Canadians to know, as a parent of young kids, as someone that respects people who wear uniforms, keeping our communities safe, I will work with them to keep communities safe.
And then New Brunswick has just announced people will need to show proof of vaccination to access certain public venues. Will you support provinces wanting to come out with vaccine mandates?
I've said I will always work with the provinces on their decisions related to proof of vaccination, QR codes, vaccine passports, what the provinces choose to do to keep people safe, to stop the spread of COVID-19 and to balance off economic concerns. They need a partner in Ottawa, and they need a partner that will be there quickly with vaccines. Get them out. Vaccines are critical. I encourage everyone to get their vaccine. We need a national leadership approach on rapid tests. We need to control our borders better for variants of concern. And we certainly don't need an election in the fourth wave of a pandemic. I've said today several times, the $600 million it costs for this election, couldn't that be used by the provinces right now in their fight against COVID-19? Couldn't it be used to keep communities safe? I will always put the interests of Canadians first, and that's something Mr. Trudeau has never done.
This will be the last question. Ce sera la dernière question.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. Chris Selly from the National Post. I wanted to ask about one of your campaign planks that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, which is the plan for a wholesale mandate review of CBC's television, English language television operations, and specifically with an eye to the PBS model in the United States. I wonder what it is about the PBS model that you think would be appropriate for Canadian public broadcasting, and whether you would be open to such a review recommending other models.
Thank you for the question, Chris. The public interest mandate is critical in terms of rural communities being connected, in terms of keeping Canadians informed, and that's the public interest side I like. What I don't like is competition with a private sector that is holding on by a thread. Some of our print and other media outlets trying to transition to the digital world and seeing the state-run broadcaster getting more and more funding under Mr. Trudeau, and in English television and in digital, competing and hollowing out jobs in the private sector, leading to less choice, less option, less voices. That, I think, needs to change in an age where our kids are watching streaming services, media is changing. the CBC needs to change too. And French language, Indigenous languages programming, radio, which is commercial free, show that the public interest can be a part of it, and I think needs to in the future, but with a much more modern approach.
You talk about legacy media outlets hanging on by a thread. They are indeed. Will you recommit today to ending the bailout to legacy print media that you say in your platform?
I've said as part of this modernization, looking at the public interest mandate of CBC, we also have to look to end the direct government supports of media, but work with them to try and make sure they can transition to the digital space, to this new media environment. We need to balance the playing field with the American web giants, and we will do that while protecting freedom of speech and internet freedom. But we do need to modernize this area of broadcasting in a way that is fair for all players, including private sector players in both languages. And this is an example of another area. Just think, the $600 million election. This gives less tools to help with the transition some economies, some media outlets are having. So Mr. Trudeau's pandemic election is yet another failed opportunity to talk about helping jobs and helping industries in Canada.
It will be all for today. Ce sera tout pour aujourd'hui. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.